Book 3, Chapter 1 of Les Misérables, translated by Isabel F. HAPGOOD. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Betty Grebe in Wapella, Illinois. Les Misérables by Victor Hugo. Book 3, Chapter 1. The year 1817. 1817 is the year which Louis XVIII, with a certain royal assurance which was not wanting in pride, entitled the 22nd of his reign. It is the year in which M. Bruguier de Soissons was celebrated. All the hairdressers' shops, hoping for powder and the return of the royal bird, were besmeared with azure and decked with fleurs-de-lis. It was the candid time at which Count Lynch sat every Sunday as churchwarden in the churchwarden's pew of Saint-Germain-des-Prés, in his costume of a peer of France, with his red ribbon and his long nose, and the majesty of profile peculiar to a man who has performed a brilliant action. The brilliant action performed by M. Lynch was this. Being mayor of Bordeaux on the 12th of March, 1814, he had surrendered the city a little too promptly to M. the Duc d'Angoulême, hence his peerage. In 1817, fashion swallowed up little boys of from 4 to 6 years of age in vast caps of morocco leather, with ear-tabs resembling esquimaux-mitres. The French army was dressed in white, after the mode of the Austrian. The regiments were called legions. Instead of numbers, they bore the names of departments. Napoleon was at St. Helena, and since England refused him green cloth, he was having his old coats turned. In 1817, Pellegrini sang, Mademoiselle Bigottini danced, Potier reigned, Audrey did not yet exist. Madame Saqui had succeeded to Forioso. There were still Prussians in France. M. Delalot was a personage. Legitimacy had just asserted itself by cutting off the hand, then the head, of Plenier, of Carbonneau, and of Talleyrand. The Prince de Talleyrand, Grand Chamberlain, and the Abbé Louis, appointed Minister of Finance, laughed as they looked at each other, with the laugh of the two augurs, both whom had celebrated on the 14th of July, 1790, the Mass of Federation in the Champ de Mars. Talleyrand said it as bishop. Louis had served it in the capacity of deacon. In 1817, in the side alleys of this same Champ de Mars, 2 great cylinders of wood might have been seen lying in the rain, rotting amid the grass, painted blue, with traces of eagles and bees, from which the gilding was falling. These were the columns which 2 years before had upheld the Emperor's platform in the Champ de Mai. They were blackened here and there with the scorches of the bivouac of Austrians encamped near Gros Caillou. 2 or 3 of these columns had disappeared in these bivouac fires, and had warmed the large hands of the imperial troops. The field of May had this remarkable point, that it had been held in the month of June, and in the field of March, Mars. In this year, 1817, 2 things were popular, the Voltaire Toquet and the snuff-box à la Charter. The most recent Parisian sensation was the crime of Dautun, who had thrown his brother's head into the fountain of the flower market. They had begun to feel anxious at the Naval Department, on account of the lack of news from that fatal frigate, the Medusa, which was destined to cover Champ-Meret with infamy and Géricault with glory. Colonel Selves was going to Egypt to become Solomon Pasha. The palace of Thermes, in the Rue de la Harpe, served as a shop for a cooper. On the platform of the octagonal tower of the Hôtel de Cluny, the little shed of boards which had served as an observatory to Mise, the naval astronomer under Louis XIV, was still to be seen. The Duchess de Duras read to 3 or 4 friends her unpublished Ourika in her boudoir furnished by 10 in sky blue satin. The ends were scratched off the Louvre. The bridge of Austerlitz had abdicated and was entitled the Bridge of the King's Garden, du Jardin du Roi, a double enigma, which disguised the bridge of Austerlitz and the Jardin des Plantes at one stroke. Louis XVIII, much preoccupied while annotating Horace with the corner of his fingernail, heroes who have become emperors, and makers of wooden shoes who have become dauphins, had 2 anxieties: Napoleon and Mathurin Brunau. The French Academy had given for its prize subject the happiness procured through study. M. Bellart was officially eloquent. In his shadow could be seen germinating that future Advocate General of Blois, dedicated to the sarcasms of Paul Louis Courier. There was a false Chateaubriand named Marchangy in the interim until there should be a false Marchangy named d'Alincourt. Claire de Albe and Malik Adel were masterpieces. Madame Cottin was proclaimed the chief writer of the epoch. The Institute had the academician Napoleon Bonaparte stricken from its list of members. A royal ordinance erected Angoulême into a naval school. For the Duc d'Angoulême being Lord High Admiral, it was evident that the city of Angoulême had all the qualities of a seaport. Otherwise the monarchical principle would have received a wound. In the Council of Ministers the question was agitated whether vignettes representing slack-rope performances which adorned Franconi's advertising posters and which attracted throngs of street urchins should be tolerated. M. Paër, the author of Agnès, a good sort of fellow, with a square face and a wart on his cheek, directed the little private concerts of the Marquis de Sassenaye in the Rue Ville l'Evêque. All the young girls were singing the Hermit of Saint-Aville, with words by Edmond Giraud. The Yellow Dwarf was transferred into Murat. The Café Lemblin stood up for the Emperor against the Café Valois, which upheld the Bourbons. The Duc de Berry, already surveyed from the shadow by Louvel, had just been married to a princess of Sicily. Madame de Staël had died a year previously. The bodyguard hissed Mademoiselle Mars. The grand newspapers were all very small. Their form was restricted, but their liberty was great. The Constitutionnel was constitutional. La Minerve called Chateaubriand Chateaubriand. That made the good middle-class people laugh heartily at the expense of the great writer. In journals which sold themselves, prostituted journalists insulted the exiles of 1815. David had no longer any talent. Arnault had no longer any wit. Carnot was no longer honest. Soult had won no battles. It is true that Napoleon had no longer any genius. No one is ignorant of the fact that letters sent to an exile by post very rarely reached him, as the police made it their religious duty to intercept them. This is no new fact. Descartes complained of it in his exile. Now David, having, in a Belgian publication, shown some displeasure at not receiving letters which had been written to him, it struck the royalist journals as amusing. And they derided the proscribed man well on this occasion. What separated 2 men more than a bis was to say the regicides, or to say the voters. to say the enemies, or to say the Allies, to say Napoleon, or to say Bonaparte. All sensible people were agreed that the era of revolution had been closed forever by King Louis XVIII., surnamed the immortal Arthur of the Château. On the platform of the Pont Neuf, the word Redivivus was carved on the pedestal that awaited the statue of Henry IV. M. Paillet, in the Rue de Teresa, No. 4, was making the rough draft of his Privy Assembly to consolidate the monarchy. The leaders of the right said at grave conjunctures, "We must write to Bacot." M. Canuel, O'Mahony, and de Chapadelaine were preparing the sketch, to some extent with Monsieur's approval, of what was to become later on the conspiracy of the bordeleux of the waterside. L'Épingle Noire was already plotting in his own quarter. De la Verderie was conferring with Trogoff. M. Decazes, who was liberal to a degree, reigned. Chateaubriand stood every morning at his window at No. 27 Rue Saint-Dominique, clad in footed trousers and slippers, with a Madras kerchief knotted over his gray hair, with his eyes fixed on a mirror, a complete set of dentist instruments spread out before him, cleaning his teeth, which were charming, while he dictated the monarchy according to the Charter to M. Pilorge, his secretary. Criticism, assuming an authoritative tone, preferred Lafon to Talma. M. de Féletez signed himself A. M. Hoffman signed himself Z. Charles Nodier wrote Thérèse Albert. Divorce was abolished. Lyceums called themselves colleges. The collegians, decorated on the collar with a golden fleur-de-lis, fought each other apropos of the King of Rome. The counter-police of the château had denounced to Her Royal Highness Madame the portrait, everywhere exhibited, of M. the Duc d'Orléans, who made a better appearance in his uniform of a colonel-general of hussars than M. the Duc de Berry in his uniform of colonel-general of dragoons, a serious inconvenience. The city of Paris was having the dome of the Invalides regilded at its own expense. Serious men asked themselves what M. de Trinquelague would do on such an occasion. M. Clausel de Montauz differed on divers points from M. Clausel de Coussergues. M. de Salaberry was not satisfied. The comedian Picard, who belonged to the Academy, which the comedian Molière had not been able to do, had the two Philiberts played at the Odéon, upon whose pediment the removal of the letters still allowed "Theatre of the Empress" to be plainly read. People took part for or against Cugenay de Montelot. Fabvier was factious, Bavot was revolutionary. The liberal Pélissier published an edition of Voltaire with following title: Works of Voltaire, the French Academy. "That will attract purchasers," said the ingenious editor. The general opinion was that M. Charles Loyson would be the genius of the century. Envy was beginning to gnaw at him, a sign of glory, and this verse was composed on him: "Even when Loyson steals, one feels that he has paws." As Cardinal Fesch refused to resign, M. de Pins, Archbishop of Amasie, administered the diocese of Lyons. The quarrel over the valley of Dappe was begun between Switzerland and France by a memoir from Captain, afterwards General Dufour. Saint-Simon, ignored, was erecting his sublime dream. There was a celebrated Fourier at the Academy of Science, whom posterity has forgotten, and in some garret an obscure Fourier, whom the future will recall. Lord Byron was beginning to make his mark. A note to a poem by Millevoye introduced him to France in these terms: a certain Lord Baron. David d'Angers was trying to work in marble. The Abbé Caron was speaking, in terms of praise, to a private gathering of seminarists in the blind alley of Feuillantines, of an unknown priest, named Félicité Robert, who at a later date became Lemony. A thing which smoked and clattered on the Seine with the noise of a swimming dog went and came beneath the windows of the Tuileries, from the Pont Royal to the Pont Louis XV. It was a piece of mechanism which was not good for much, a sort of plaything, the idle dream of a dream-ridden inventor, an utopia, a steamboat. The Parisians stared indifferently at this useless thing. M. de Vaublanc, the reformer of the Institute by a coup d'état, the distinguished author of numerous academicians, ordinances, and batches of members, after having created them, could not succeed in becoming one himself. The Faubourg Saint-Germain and the Pavillon de Marsan wished to have M. Delaveau for prefect of police on account of his piety. Dupuytren and Récamier entered into a quarrel in the amphitheatre of the School of Medicine, and threatened each other with their fists on the subject of the divinity of Jesus Christ. Cuvier, with one eye on Genesis and the other on nature, tried to please bigoted reaction by reconciling fossils with texts and by making mastodons flatter Moses. M. François de Neufchâteau, the praiseworthy cultivator of the memory of Parmentier, made 1,000 efforts to have the pomme de terre, potato, pronounced Parmentier, and succeeded therein not at all. The Abbé Grégoire, ex-bishop, ex-conventionary, ex-senator, had passed, in the royal polemics, to the state of infamous Grégoire, the locution of which we have made use, passed to the state of, has been condemned as a neologism by M. Royer Collard. Under the third arch of the Pont du Jena, the new stone with which, the 2 years previously, the mining aperture made by Blücher to blow up the bridge had been stopped up, was still recognizable on account of its whiteness. Justice summoned to its bar a man who, on seeing the Comte d'Artois enter Notre Dame, had said aloud, "Sapristi! I regret the time when I saw Bonaparte and Talma enter the Belle Sauvage, arm in arm." A seditious utterance, 6 months in prison. Traitors showed themselves unbuttoned. Men who had gone over to the enemy on the eve of battle made no secret of their recompense, and strutted immodestly in the light of day, in the cynicism of riches and dignities. Deserters from Ligny and Quatre Bras, in their brazenness of their well-paid turpitude, exhibited their devotion to the monarchy in most barefaced manner. This is what floats up confusedly, pell-mell for the year 1817, and is now forgotten. History neglects nearly all these particulars, and cannot do otherwise. The infinity would overwhelm it. Nevertheless, these details, which are wrongly called trivial, there are no trivial facts in humanity, nor little leaves in vegetation, are useful. It is of the signomy of the years that the signomy of the centuries is composed. In this year of 1817, 4 young Parisians arranged a fine farce. End of Book 3, Chapter 1 of Les Misérables by Victor Hugo. Recording by Betty Grebe in Wapella, Illinois.